Have you wondered whether game mode or game performance is a better wrapper to use when gaming on Linux? Which one gives you the best average frame rate boost? Which one gives you the smoothest gameplay? Or do neither of them work? In this video, I take a CPU limited system running CachyOS and run the Red Dead Redemption 2 and Cyberpunk 2077 benchmark tools 40 times each to see which wrapper is the best. If you're a Linux gamer, this video will change how you think about optimization. Before we get into it, if you want to see more Linux benchmarks or want to dive into tutorials on how to get the most out of your setup, like this video and hit the subscribe button. Let's jump right in. This test system is running an AMD Ryzen 7 1700X processor, which is about 8 years old. I have an NVIDIA RTX 3080 with 10 gigabytes of VRAM. It's running 16 gigabytes of RAM using CachyOS. For the sake of consistency, I ran the same NVIDIA drivers in the same Proton GE version 11-1 while benchmarking Red Dead 2 and Cyberpunk. I should also mention that due to a bug, the Mango HUD overlay caused really bad dithering during gameplay. It looked like the proper color depth was missing. All footage shown in the video is from the same system taken with Mango HUD disabled. I ran the same 4 configurations as last time. Baseline, no enhancements, no game performance, no game mode, and the ananicy-cpp service running normally. Game mode with ananicy-cpp still running. Game mode with ananicy-cpp stopped, and game performance, which is the recommended wrapper by the CachyOS development team. I also noticed while testing that the game performance mode was not compatible with my CPU, and I had to run a special command in terminal to actually change the performance mode. Each configuration was run 10 times on each game, and I collected the average frames per second, the 1% and 0.1% lows, CPU load, CPU clock speed, and temperatures, averaged across those 10 runs per configuration. For Red Dead 2, I kept using the Saint Denis segment for the same reason as before. It's the densest, most CPU-sensitive part of the benchmark. I ran the benchmarks at a 1920 by 1080 resolution with all graphics settings set to low. I wanted to take as much pressure off the GPU as possible to force a CPU bottleneck. Everything else stayed consistent with the last test. Same benchmark tools, same monitoring approach, same 4 configurations run back to back so ambient conditions stay comparable. One thing that came up before I could even start, CachyOS's game performance wrapper didn't apply cleanly on the 1700X. To actually get that configuration into a performance state, I had to force it manually before launching the game rather than relying on the wrapper to handle it automatically. And that's something to consider if you're using an older CPU like I am. For Cyberpunk, the baseline frame rate averaged at 88.7 frames per second. Every single tuned configuration beat it. Game mode with ananicy-cpp hit 91.8 frames per second, game performance hit 91.2, and game mode without ananicy-cpp hit 90.7. That's about 2 to 3 frames per second, or about 2 to 3.5% difference. And it shows up in the 1% lows too, which improved from 60.9 frames per second at baseline to around 62.1 to 62.4 for all 3 tuned configurations. The same kind of oddity as last video's game performance surprise in Red Dead 2, just on a different configuration. Game mode without ananicy-cpp has the second best average frames per second and the strong 1% low, but its 0.1% low is the worst of the 4. 46.9 FPS versus 54.2 for game performance. Best average, worst case. That's worth keeping in mind if the stutter bothers you more than the average number. The average CPU clock speed on the 1700X is basically identical everywhere, no matter what you run. And that actually makes sense once you think about what's driving the clock speed in the first place. On this rig, the CPU is the bottleneck, meaning it's already under sustained full load. A chip under sustained full load boosts close to its own ceiling regardless of which governor or scheduling tool is active. None of these four configurations is doing anything special to unlock the clock speed because there's nothing left to unlock. The workload itself is already asking for everything the chip has, so the small FPS gain here isn't a clock speed story at all, it's a scheduling one. The results for Red Dead Redemption 2 is the exact opposite of my last video. When limited by GPU, game mode and game performance saw an increase of 5 to 7 frames per second. On the 1700X, where I'm CPU limited, I actually lost performance. Average FPS at baseline was 71.4. Every tune configuration was slower. Game mode with ananicy-cpp dropped down to 68.5, game performance dropped to 70.1, and game mode without ananicy-cpp, the worst of the four, down to 66.1. The 1% lows followed the exact same order. Baseline at top at 41.7, down to 38.9 for the worst tune config. The 1% and 0.1% lows in Red Dead 2 contradict the CachyOS wiki recommendation of disabling ananicy-cpp when using game mode. Baseline posts the best 1% low of any configuration, 41.7 frames per second, and the second best 0.1% lows at 33 frames per second, beaten only by game mode with ananicy-cpp at 33.8 frames per second. Game performance, the wiki's recommended default, sits in the middle of the pack on the 1% lows at 40.7 FPS, but posts the worst 1% low of all four configurations, just 30.9 FPS, worse than doing nothing at all. So the tool CachyOS points you toward as the safe, no compromises option is the one most likely to give you the roughest single frame of the run on the CPU. That's a strange result for a just use this recommendation to produce. There were a lot of surprising findings on these benchmarks. First, Cyberpunk and Red Dead 2 behaved completely differently on the CPU. In Cyberpunk 2077, the baseline configuration didn't perform as well as both game mode and game performance. The baseline in Red Dead 2 tested as the most efficient, providing the highest average frame rate, best 1% lows, and second best 0.1% lows. Disabling ananicy-cpp was actually detrimental, contradicting the CachyOS wiki. Running game mode with ananicy-cpp disabled actually decreased performance in both games compared to game mode with ananicy-cpp running. That contradicts my findings in a previous video, where disabling the service actually caused an increase in frame rates, 1% lows, and 0.1% lows. I had a hypothesis going into the benchmarking that because I'm CPU limited, I expected the clock speed of the CPU to be maxed out across all four configurations. Game performance mode sets the CPU to performance mode, maxing out the clock speed. Baseline and game performance should see somewhat identical results. What I saw, however, was that game performance mode did better in Cyberpunk 2077 and baseline performed better in Red Dead 2. My theory is that since Red Dead 2 is more CPU intensive than Cyberpunk 2077, it leaves less room for game mode to handle scheduling tasks. Game performance is still going full tilt, which is giving less clearance for the scheduler to accurately handle tasks. Either that or game performance is preventing the CPU from hitting its max boost clock speed when it needs to, which is then causing task scheduling mishaps. I can't definitively make a recommendation on which wrapper to use like I did in my previous video, but hopefully I gave you the tools to make that call on your own. The best part about using Linux is you can make these granular configuration changes on a per game basis and choose which one is best for you. So the ultimate takeaway? There's no one-size-fits-all answer here. What works for one CPU might actively hurt performance on another. Don't just take my word for it. Use the tools I've shown you, test it on your favorite games, and find your sweet spot. When you do, come back and comment with your hardware and your findings. If this deep dive helped you navigate the messy reality of Linux optimization, hit that like button and subscribe. And if you want to see how these results looked on a different rig, check out my previous GPU limited benchmark right here. And I'll catch you guys in the next video.